Hello, my name is Natacha Bolaños. I work with the Lymphoma Coalition. I'm patient advocate and I am in charge of the management of the European region. And I'm also the Global Alliances Manager because I love to build partnerships. I have been working with the Lymphoma Coalition since 2017, but I have been involved in patient advocacy since 2011. And I have a background as cancer rehabilitation specialist. And today, I will be speaking to you about the health systems in Europe. I will present an overview, and I want to focus also in how patient advocacy are involved in the management or in the decision-making in health issues in Europe. Just to provide you with an overview of my presentation, I will start by introducing where we are. Then I will walk through how healthcare systems in Europe work and a comparison with other areas of the world as it is United States. And I think it's good to remember how patient advocacy started, how has been the evolution, and provide examples of patient involvement in Europe. And I want to provide you with concrete examples on what we have done in cutaneous lymphoma recently, and then I will end my presentation talking about future trends. I wanted to start by remarking the changing world where we live today. This is how our meetings looked 2 years ago, and this is how our meetings look today. So we won't deny that we have lived a terrible event with the pandemic that have had an impact in the entire world and in all areas of patient care in general. Even the way as patient advocates are participating today in decision-making in health has been pretty modified. I think we should take the learnings from this experience that hasn't ended yet. And it's good to remember always where we were a few years ago, where we are now, and have in mind where we want to be in the future. Generally speaking, most of European nations, in addition to other areas of the world, have some type of universal healthcare. According to the definition provided by the World Health Organization, this means that everyone has equal access to quality healthcare that improves the health of patients, and that seeking such care would not cause financial harm to those receiving care. While I think that in America, it's easy to generalize that European healthcare is like one giant conglomerate of universal coverage. But there are actually many different systems in Europe. Each country has figured out their own way of organizing their insurance companies, the hospital systems, the primary care, and how all these levels interact among themselves. But regardless of country, healthcare in Europe in general is designed with the same goal in mind: to make sure every person, every citizen has access to basic health services. I want to remark basic, because there are some countries that do not have access, for instance, to innovative medicines, but you can guarantee that you will have access to essential medicines. That puts cancer and rare cancers in particular into a very dangerous area, because for rare diseases, treatments are scarce. There is a lack of expertise to provide early diagnosis, even to recognize symptoms, And this may be the case for cutaneous lymphoma. And that's why it's important to keep an eye on all the ways of involvement patients and patient organizations may have to improve, to shape that healthcare that we want for cutaneous lymphoma patients. Given that European nations have all been around far longer than America, they've tried almost every possible scenario, and for most part, they've landed largely on three systems: single payer, socialized, and privatized. But all of them are pre-regulated. There is quite a bit of variety between countries, and no two systems are alike. They may be similar, but they are not the same. One of the major similarities across healthcare in Europe is that all citizens are included, as I mentioned before. And this happens even in partially privatized systems. There is an individual mandate to ensure that healthy people are connected also with the health system, with the purpose of provide early care when possible, or even prevention measurements whenever possible. That's not what happens in reality, because capacity constraints, because lack of health literacy, but at least the principle is there. The American healthcare system functions pretty differently than the European ones. And I would differentiate predominantly also, in addition to what I mentioned before, in the ownership form of healthcare providers. In Europe, the source of healthcare financing may be different. The prevailing source of financing can be taxes. That's the case in United Kingdom, in Denmark, in Finland, Greece, Iceland, Ireland, Norway, Portugal, Spain, where I live, Sweden. There are other countries where it is through the social insurance. That's the case of Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, and Luxembourg. And there are some other countries where a combination of taxes and social insurance, and this is the case of Italy, or a combination of private sources and social insurance. That's the case of the Netherlands. Or private sources completely, that's the case of Switzerland. From the ownership point of view, providers can be predominantly public or a combination of the two. And since United Kingdom is a prime example, I would say, of the national health service model, their approach is referred as the British model, and commonly other countries that have a look, keep an eye on how the British model made decision making in order to try to make it possible or to replicate in their countries. The cost of healthcare is expected to double by 2050 if reforms are not undertaken. This statement was declared before pandemic, meaning that we need to consider now this new place where we are. And this is being driven by a number of factors, including demographics. There is an increased life expectancy and aging population in Europe, so we expect healthcare costs will rise. This includes the costs of the increased prevalence of non-communicable diseases where cancer belongs and where cutaneous lymphoma belongs, or chronic diseases such as cardiovascular, chronic respiratory, or diabetes. This chart shows healthcare expenditure as a percentage of gross domestic product, as well as the mix of public and private expenditure across many European countries. And technological advances in medicine, which can increase efficiencies, over the longer term are increasing short-term costs, meaning that there are some countries that will stay behind when it comes to incorporate not only technology, but to take all the digitalization that is being possible thanks to the development of the virtual world because of the pandemic, and also the access to innovative medicines. But expenditure does not necessarily equate to better outcomes. In fact, there are significant differences in outcomes across, as well as within countries. In the case of Spain, for instance, where I live, so I know well this case, we have several regions. The country is organized by different communities, is decentralized, the budgets and the decision making. And so we have different health outcomes, and not always the health outcomes are proportional or correlate to the expenditure. It is therefore important to understand the determinants of health. Today, big data can play an important role in the analysis of outcomes, but this can be tricky because when we talk about big data, in an ideal world, we should have like a super nice platform where all the database were pooled, when we could be able to study the prevalence, the incidence, the causes of the diseases, risk factors, prognosis, etc., etc. But what we see in real world is that hospitals rely on several different ways to record information. Not all of them use digital means. Sometimes there are papers, PDF, videos, imaging. There are several sources of information. You cannot cross all this information. There is no yet a harmonized pattern of collecting this information. However, we need to keep big data in our mind, and especially as patient advocates, because one of our missions should be also to collect data to be able to provide insights for the decision making. So I was telling that big data can play an important role in the analysis of outcomes, not only in terms of health, but also more broadly on social and economic outcomes. And yes, health data is limited, is fragmented. We need more transparency, we need more accessibility. So when we report this expenditure in healthcare, is not perfect. It's reliable, but sometimes it's not perfect and won't reflect at all what is the situation of the patients or the access these patients have in each country to diagnosis tests, especially new diagnosis tests and innovative medicines, or to care in general. I mean, to multidimensional care, that holistic concept that incorporates the social dimension, the psychological support, and other areas where we as patient advocates are specialized in defining. So healthcare needs to be more patient-centered. And part of the work that needs to be done yet is empowering patients, empowering citizens in general, I would say, to monitor and maximize their health. And this requires a paradigm shift in the way that healthcare systems are run, in the creation of value for patients that should determine the rewards for all other actors in the systems. And value should depend on results, not inputs. And therefore, value in healthcare should be measured by the outcomes achieved and not by the volume of services delivered. That is how actually some healthcare systems measure the results. Healthcare systems are complex, we all know that, and include a myriad of stakeholders who have conflicting goals. such as access to services, profitability, high quality, cost containment, safety, convenience, satisfaction. Yeah, okay. But I want to make a stop to remember from the patient advocacy point of view. Do you remember where we were 40 years ago? I can tell you that there was no social healthcare system in Europe, in Spain, for instance. And one of the most striking changes in healthcare policy making over the past 40 years have been the growing attentiveness to the voice of patients. I just want to remember that in 1980s, we were living the AIDS plague. If you haven't seen this yet, I recommend you to see this documentary, How to Survive a Plague, beginning at the start of the AIDS epidemic in New York. The documentary follows a group of activists. They were behaving more like activists rather than patient advocates, but we have things in common. They were founders of the AIDS group ACT UP and followed their struggle for response from the government and medical establishment in developing effective medications. Activists, or if you want to call patient advocates, took it upon themselves to convince the FDA, the regulator body, to approve drugs which could slow or even halt the disease virus, and demanded that drug trials, which would usually take from 7 to 10 years, be shortened, so potentially life-saving treatments could be made available. The film also documents the underground market for HIV drugs, and many people relied on that time on drugs imported from other countries, which were believed to potentially slow down the virus despite not being FDA approved. These later suppose also an impact on the way regulations are written today. I don't want to invest too much time on this story, but I want you to keep in mind. But I think it's interesting to take a look to the evolution of the patient advocacy. By the 90s, individuals, patients started to run properly the concept of advocacy, but with very little expertise. Most of the times they didn't have vote. Probably they had voice, but not vote. So that was not real patient engagement or involvement. By the 2000, the patient groups were started to be invited to the table, and they were gaining credibility and expertise, also because the community started to expand and to cover several disease areas, and especially those life-changing diseases, as it is the case of cancer or cutaneous lymphoma. And the success by that time was defined by the legitimate roles that we could achieve as patients, by the amount, the quality, and the areas where we could incorporate our input, or the areas where we could be part of the open consultation. By 2010, we started to listen everywhere the concept of patient centricity. It was more a vocabulary than a real way to proceed. However, we should welcome, that new thinking that also has helped to shape the future changes that we have living today. And by that time, the success was measured in way of achieving the perspectives, driving research and development, our insights being incorporated in health policy, how patients' rights were broadly recognized. And by 2020, that's where we are today. I would say pre-pandemic, patients started doing research and making policy as well. And patient values were incorporated, strongly incorporated, and were seen by regulators and payers as an important parameter when it comes to define value. So today we define success as expert patients with high level training, capable to talk at the same level with clinicians, regulators, policymakers, payers, and so on. And so with this introduction, I want now to explain you how we interact in Europe, the patient advocacy community. I will focus only in the area of cancer because I think it's the area that most interest us for the purposes of lymphoma. And I will also stress the blood cancers. So we have several bodies that are interesting to partner with, starting by the European Medicines Agency, because it's the body that needs to approve clinical trials, need to approve medicines, devices, etc. The European Medicines Agency has a protocol to legitimate patient organizations that are eligible to partner with them. You need to have, there are some criteria, inclusion criteria, to be part of that list of patient organizations eligible. And I will explain later how we participate there. The European Cancer Organization, this is a group that is focused on making lobby and policy, but has a strong influence in Brussels, in the European Parliament, and has put the patient voice in a very first line of decision making. And we have there a patient advocacy committee with 16 patient organizations, patient umbrella organizations. So each of them has many, many others behind. For instance, in the case of Lymphoma Coalition, we have close to 40 patient organizations working in the lymphoma field in Europe. So, and that happens with every cancer umbrella patient organization. For the ESMO, the European Society for Medical Oncology, we also have a patient organization working group. There is a membership with a reduced fee for patient advocates that provides you with access to scientific knowledge and papers and all the literature published by ESMO. Then we have the UNETA, is the European Body for Health Technology Assessment. They have a more informal way to incorporate the patient voice, but we are there trying also to improve that. The European Hematology Association has patient organizations. It was an informal working group and working now on making a formal committee and connecting this committee to the decision making from the board to all the scientific working groups and all the areas where the European Hematology Association operates. And we have also a network of Rare Cancer Europe. We have an European reference network that I will explain later. And we can differentiate how we are organized in the patient advocacy concept for cancer in general, blood cancers, more specific, rare cancers, where we could also incorporate the cutaneous lymphoma. Starting by the European Medicines Agency, patients have been actively interacting since the creation of the agency in 1995. This cooperation was extended to include consumer groups with an interest in medicines, and the stakeholder groups bring real life experience as well as specific knowledge and expertise to scientific discussions on medicines and the impact of regulatory decisions. Collaborating with patients for EMA supports transparency improves the regulatory processes. And we are involved in a wide range of EMA activities. For instance, just to mention a few, we are members of the management board. We participate in scientific committees and provide scientific advice when it comes to approve or do the assessments for medicines that are applying for marketing authorization. We take part in discussions on the development, not only the authorization, but the development when the clinical trials start of medicines, or in the decision-making on orphan designation. We also review written information on medicines prepared by the agency. I can tell you that we invest a lot of hours on this work, reviewing patient leaflets, reviewing documents that will support the appraisal. We are involved sometimes in the preparation of guidelines, not at the very beginning, but we are part of the consultation bodies that are currently called. And that was the case with all the changes that were made during the pandemic to facilitate the clinical trials, for instance. And we take part also in the agency conferences and workshops. And here in this slide, you can see the evolution of how patients have increased their number, their participation in the activities of the European Medicines Agency. Lymphoma Coalition, the European branch, was approved as an eligible organization in March 2019 after passing a very hard process of eligibility. And we are now partnering with EMA to do a lot of things, including the approval of medicines for cutaneous lymphoma. I mentioned before the European reference networks. These are networks of centers of expertise and healthcare providers that are organized across borders so that clinicians and researchers share expertise, knowledge, and resources across Europe. The specific European reference network for our case, lymphoma and cutaneous lymphoma, is EuroBloodNet. This is the European reference network on rare hematologic diseases. The purpose of the European reference centers contributes to the purpose, the idea, the dream is that we will have improvements in clinical outcomes and the quality of life of people living with rare diseases. And we are pretty conscious that everything needs to start by improving the knowledge, the capacity building, and not only including the clinicians and all the healthcare professionals, but also the patient organizations and the patients as end users. From last year, we were working with the EuroBloodNet on a new concept, topics on focus, and together with Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation, France's Lymphoma Espoir, EuroOrdis, and the Lymphoma Coalition, we partnered to put together a webinar program, two webinar programs. One was intended to target clinicians, and the idea was to provide high-level knowledge on cutaneous lymphoma in the different presentations of cutaneous lymphoma, disseminate very innovative topics related to the disease, but also we develop a series of webinars to target specifically patient organizations in order to give visibility to the medical services available in Europe to improve our capacity and to also connect better the patient organizations with the clinicians community. This has been a very interesting experience. All the webinars are recorded and are part of the EuroBloodNet YouTube channel. So if you haven't seen yet, I invite you to take a look because there is pretty valuable information there, and patient representatives, including Susan, and thanks for your work there, Lorna and myself and Guy Bouguet from Lymphoma Squad, and also we took some learnings from Lymphoma Action and from our organization in Switzerland from Rosemary Pope. And we put together the content, we participate in the decision making on the topics that should be covered, who should be the speakers. Patients have been involved also as speakers because we consider that is the only way to understand where the unmet needs are and how the experience should modify the care. EuroBloodNet has also a repository of cases where clinicians can make consultations or can bring their cases to have certain advice from the experts around Europe. Okay, the European Hematology Association, I guess that you all know, this is the scientific society. This is the equivalent to ASH, but in Europe. We partner a lot with the European Hematology Association. We haven't achieved yet to have a reduced fee for being a member, but we are currently advocated for that. But what is really important is that we have built a patient advocacy working group, that we participate actively with 2 formal positions in the European Affairs Committee, that we provide insights to shape the Congress scientific program. And we also have support from EHA to organize capacity building meetings, to have rooms for private meetings when we were doing face-to-face. Now in the virtual environment, everything has changed, but we continue to participate in the decision-making for the program. We also have a EHA patient joint policy symposium where we, when we discuss high-level topics, not only about the development of research findings, but also policy-making, access, sustainability of healthcare systems, and affordability of medicine, price and reimbursement, and many, many other topics. We have also a strong voice in some scientific working groups. That's the case of the quality of life and symptoms and aging and hematology working groups, but there are specific working groups for each disease, and there is one for lymphoma where we also have, are very welcome. There is one interesting thing. There is a standing invitation to patient organizations to submit publications on access to medicines in Hemasphere, which is a journal promoted by the European Hematology Association. We are part of the research roadmap. There is a development of, well, it was more a validation of the magnitude of clinical benefit scale that was developed by ESMO. And this has been validated previous tests and adaptation to hematology malignancies. We are currently working strongly in a project to diminish the bureaucracy in clinical research. And we try to promote also personalized medicine and access to medicines. And currently, the European Hematology Association is active in publishing clinical practice guidelines. And we are also providing input for that in order to incorporate survivorship, follow-up needs, even patient information. That's one of our objectives, to put that directly on the clinical guidelines so we can really improve the patient experience in the future. The case of the European Society for Blood and Marrow Transplantation, I won't go in depth in this because it's pretty similar, but I want you to know that we participate in the Lymphoma Working Party, and we also are part of the Patient Advocacy Committee and the recently created registry for CAR T-cell therapy in Europe, as it was the mandate by the European Medicines Agency. What is relevant is the BMT is a registry. and it's all connected with blood and marrow transplantation. But as science evolves and cell and gene therapy are becoming standard, let's say, or are coming to, to the more advances, and it's possible now in the markets for treating patients. EBMT has moved to launch the cell and gene registries in Europe. So it's very important what we will do next there to ensure that in the future we could collect in the registry not only the clinical outcomes, but also the patient-reported outcomes and the measurements on quality of life. The case of European Society of Medical Oncology is interesting to keep an eye because they continue publishing guidelines, and the Congress, the annual Congress, even if it's not focused on hematologic malignancies, sometimes they include interesting sessions, but they are very active on policy, on advocacy, on access, on bringing personalized medicine to the next level in access to diagnosis, because in some cases, if you don't have the diagnosis tool to provide that precision in the information, the molecular information or whatever it may be required to match with an innovative treatment, then you cause a barrier for that treatment to be prescribed to the patient. So it's important to see beyond the treatment when and to try to see the entire patient journey when we shape our patient advocacy work. I want to remark this cooperation. We also partner with the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industry. And 2 years ago, we started to work in this project, Time to Patient Access project, and it was intended to measure the differences or the time between the European Medicines Agency approval and the reimbursement access to the new oncology medicines, oncology. So we included several from the hematology malignancies, but there were many of oncology, no? And here you can see pretty easily that some countries have very, very long delays, close to 1,000 days, meaning that, 3 years later than the medicine has been approved at European level, it will be available for the patients in a given country. But why all this happens? This happens because of HTA, the health technology assessments. And that's why it's so relevant, the interaction between the health technology assessments and the patients in relations to medicines for human use. Just to put an example, as present, millions of people around the globe are receiving the vaccination for the COVID virus. And these vaccines were developed in months, not years, and many on entirely new platforms. And this is just an example of how we can accelerate the piece of science and medical innovation. But health technology assessment agencies plays a vital role in assessing the safety and the efficacy, and to translate this into cost benefit of new treatments. And their decisions have an impact on the length and the quality of life of patients. The HTA agencies use various approaches to incorporate the patient input in their work, but there is no harmonized way to provide this input, and there is no a formal procedure either in some countries. The lack of HTA agencies in some, it's a little proportion, but in some European countries also makes much more difficult to understand how they approve the medicines and the reimbursement for those medicines, and at the end, those cost barriers for the patients. But this is fundamental for the national availability of any medicine for our patients. So just for you to know how we partner in this area, well, we participate in the open consultations that the European network of HTA runs, but that's not a mandatory decision today. Is not directly incorporated into the country's decision making. So what happens is that after that process to happen, each country will do their own assessment to make their positive or negative decision on reimburse that medicine. We have very active members participating in all these. I want to bring only one case, but there are many others. The case I'm presenting here is from UK, and I'm presenting this because the NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence in UK, has probably one of the most, the best structured procedures to incorporate the patient voice. Our member organization, Lymphoma Action, who has a strong development on cutaneous lymphoma, also is regularly providing input, not only representing the organization as a whole, I mean the community as a whole, but also by presenting individual patient experiences from patient experts. And these are incorporated in the appraisal of new medicines. I think this is a very important part of our work, and we should cooperate more and share best practices in this area. And but this is a work we are doing now in France and Finland and in Serbia and many other countries. And then after that, I want to stress also the role that we have achieved in research and development of medicines. Patients can be involved across the process of medicines development, I mean, across the entire process. This diagram that is part of the EUPATI, the European Patients Academy, identifies some existing areas in which patients are involved in the process. And it distinguishes also between the level of expertise in a disease area, for instance, that is required, and the different areas where involvement can take place. I think this is a diagram that we should learn by heart to know where the future should be. I mean, how we can very actively shape the cutaneous lymphoma care that we would like to have, or at least to work to make it possible. And we can participate from setting the research priorities, from defining the endpoints, helping to define also the inclusion criteria or the exclusion criteria to participate in clinical research, the way the information is disseminated and published, because most of research is never published, especially if it failed to accomplish their objective. We can also help to produce protocol synopsis readable for patients, or to improve informed consents, to be part of the ethical review, to be part of the trial steering committee, to help to shape patient support programs, also to facilitate the access to clinical trials. Many times these are run in reference centers, and many patients live pretty far from those centers. So, but this is a topic to build another one-day presentation, so I won't extend more today here. one of the last things of my presentation is this very, very important achievement that was presented this week in Europe. After signing the Berlin Declaration, Europe United Against Cancer, the trio presidency of the European Council of Germany, Portugal, and Slovenia launched a bottom-up initiative to enhance patient involvement in cancer research, finally. And the first step we're taking on an initial brainstorming event involving scientists and patients in September 2020, and from September 2020 to December, over 130 contributors from 16 countries across Europe came together to collect and discuss basic principles of successful patient involvement. They did that by sharing best practices, by studying what was already in practice in several countries. These experts or contributors represented patient organizations, patient experts, cancer research, medical healthcare professionals, industry, funding organizations, and policymaking level. And everybody expressed their opinions and areas of knowledge and expertise. And the final result of the process was presented in a document that collects the principles. It's not an academic paper. It is not meant to be an exhaustive of all existing knowledge. It's not intended to say how to conduct meaningful involvement in cancer research, but rather is intended to serve as an initial point of reference and a resource for further information and future steps of implementation, and possibly in other areas of health research. This document is the compilation of everybody's input, especially provided by cancer patients. And I think it's a good declaration of intentions of how we should be involved in the immediate future, but it will be in our hands to make it possible or not. It's important to keep the momentum, and that's not always easy. And last but not least, I think it's important to keep an eye on the future trends. The future is clearly shaped, or will be clearly shaped, by evidence-based advocacy. It's not anymore enough to have an opinion or to have a personal perspective. We need evidence, and for that we need to collect data on the patient experience. There is a place also for venture philanthropy. It's undeniable, the digital transformation. Every decision making should rely on real world evidence more than in research evidence. So everything that should be accomplished because of clinical research should be then confirmed by real world evidence, where we can also incorporate, for instance, in the case of clinical trial, patients that are not, because of their conditions, are not good candidates or can not pass the inclusion criteria. And we need honest partners. We have learned since the pandemic started that the world is written today by new behaviors, that technology has moved to a first place, to a key role. There is the mobility has changed dramatically now, and globalization is the new trend. No, the digital revolution has already happened, and we are living in the aftermath. Telemedicine needs to be the new normal, also not to replace, but to complement the medical care and the medical multidimensional assistance. And I would end by telling that the potential for future system improvement is vast, but depends in part on increased patient participation. And healthcare must find a way to shift from the doctor will see the patient now to the patient will see the doctor now. I know this is pretty ambitious and probably a little mad, but patients need engagement beyond passively receiving services. And this will be challenging until patients can easily access and use their health data. So I think that we have had enough to open for discussions. And I thank you, everybody, for your attention over this long presentation. I'm here to help. So thank you.